and welcome to our live coverage of the Republican National Convention. I'm Chief Investigator Brendan Keefe with Atlanta News First Investigates, and you're watching Atlanta News First Plus or joining us on YouTube. It's good to have you here again for our live stream of the Republican National Convention. A lot happened last night. Several speakers, in fact, pretty much all of Donald Trump's opponents from the primary took the stage to give him full-throated endorsements. The former president was back in the hall again. This is a change from tradition where you wouldn't see the nominee or presumptive nominee. He's already the nominee, but back then it used to be presumptive nominee. You wouldn't see them until the day they were nominated and gave their acceptance speech. But Donald Trump has been in the hall for the last 2 days, last 2 nights, and he was also there with his running mate, JD Vance. But the big thing last night was that we had those former opponents take the stage. Now remember, they were vehemently anti-Trump on the debate stage when running for the Republican nomination. And a lot of them were trying to be the alternative to Donald Trump, most notably Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley had stayed in the race the longest. She stayed in even beyond when there was any path for her to get the nomination. But she stayed in because she said she wanted to be that alternative for Trump, and she believed that she had the best chance of winning the general election against Joe Biden. She was not originally invited to the convention at all. And then she was given a speaking role, and that happened after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump on Saturday. By all accounts, Donald Trump has had a change of heart in certain areas. There's been talk of unity, but what we have seen is that's not unity with the other side being the Democrats or the liberals, but unity within the Republican Party itself. And that certainly was on display last night because Nikki Haley, who again wasn't even invited a week ago, took the stage and actually gave a full-throated endorsement of Donald Trump, said he had the best chance of beating Joe Biden, said that Joe Biden as the alternative was far worse, and that, these are her words, and that, of course, Donald Trump would be the next president of the United States, both the 45th and 47th president of the United States, if indeed he wins re-election with that Biden term in the middle. All of that, of course, is up in the air, but what you now have is a unified, for the most part, Republican Party. Boy, just 6 months ago, can you imagine saying that phrase on television or a live stream, a unified Republican Party? The party was fractured. There were all different factions within the party that weren't talking to each other, that were against each other. And obviously, we've seen challenges to the Speaker of the House and all of that. There was sort of disarray. Now the disarray has flipped sides. The disarray is on the side of the Democratic Party, where you have still an open-ended question of whether Joe Biden is ultimately the nominee of the Democratic Party. Talk of him being replaced at the top of the ticket has slowed down since Saturday, since the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. But Joe Biden, as of right now, is still the presumptive nominee because he won all of the primaries. So the ball is in his court. He gets to decide whether he drops out of the race or not. And the talk, even amongst Joe Biden, is that if there's any alternative, it's his own Vice President, Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris her name was invoked several times last night in the Republican National Convention. In fact, Nikki Haley mentioned her and said she had said first that a vote for Joe Biden was a vote for Kamala Harris because of the likelihood that she would have to step in and fill out the rest of his next term if he's reelected. Last night she said, see, I was right. We now know after the debate, the poor debate performance by Joe Biden, that the likelihood of a presidency for his vice president ascending to the White House and to running things was more likely because of what happened in the debate with Joe Biden. So that was sort of Nikki Haley's message. Wasn't just that Donald Trump was the best one to beat Joe Biden, but that really Donald Trump was the best alternative to Kamala Harris. So they are openly running against Kamala Harris, which suggests that there is at least concern, if not, planning to run against Kamala Harris rather than Joe Biden. Again, still an open question within the Democratic Party whether or not there is going to be a change at the top of the ticket. So back to what happened last night at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. You saw a unified Republican Party, a unified front. You see a unified message now with essentially everybody reading from the same hymnal, if you will. Tonight, is really the second biggest night of the convention, because you are going to see on this floor of the convention, this is a live look now. If you're watching us later on YouTube, it's not live, but as of live right now in our stream is a shot of the convention hall in Milwaukee. There is no open session right now, which is why you see it fairly empty, other than some reporters milling about and some people up in the suites that are converted into TV studios. But on that stage, you're going to see JD Vance deliver his speech. JD Vance is the nominee for vice president for the Republican Party. He's a freshman senator out of Ohio. A fascinating story, which you're going to hear tonight. They're going to play his biography. It is quite literally a rags to riches story, at least from a political standpoint, because he grew up in very small town, Middletown, Ohio. It's between Cincinnati and Dayton. He grew up very poor. His mother was suffered from addiction, and he also had challenges. His father wasn't around. He was raised by his grandparents. But he had a fascinating story where he took that story and became a U.S. Marine. He said the Marines hardened him, not just like, in terms of his character, but rather made him from a boy to a man, and really sort of developed his deep sense of commitment to the United States, not just as a country, but as a concept. And then he went on to write a book. He became a best-selling author with Hillbilly Elegy. A lot of people mistake this as an Appalachian story, although it does have Appalachian echoes in it. Middletown isn't in the Appalachian section of Ohio, which would be southeast Ohio. It's more western Ohio. Little inside baseball there, but it's a very similar story about sort of overcoming challenges. And then he takes that and enters politics, and he ran for Senate in 2022. Now imagine that we're talking about somebody who could be a heartbeat away from the presidency, who wasn't even in politics until 2022, or at least the race in 2022. So here we are, barely 2 years later, and we have someone who could be vice president of the United States who 2 years ago wasn't even in politics. Sound familiar? Sound like Donald Trump back in 2016? When he entered the race in 2015, he had never held any political office. And not only did he become the 45th president of the United States, but he could become the 47th as well, only the second president in U.S. history to run for to win a non-consecutive term, if that indeed happens in November. So J.D. Vance will take the stage tonight. Expect a speech that is very much speaking from the Donald Trump policy, the sort of policy that the Republicans have endorsed already. It is their platform that they've already voted on, and it is the Donald Trump platform. There isn't much daylight between J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, except that J.D. Vance is a little bit more of a conservative or modern conservative, if you will, than Donald Trump. But remember, it's Donald Trump's party. And also he's at the top of the ticket. So as is always the case, expect to see this vice presidential nominee fall in line with the man at the top of the ticket. So that's what's going to happen tonight in terms of J.D. Vance accepting the nomination and also sort of teeing up Donald Trump to deliver his acceptance speech tomorrow night to close out the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. There have been no real hiccups so far. It's been expertly stage-crafted and stage-managed. And so far, despite all of the tumult that has brought us here, it has been very well run by all accounts, from a production standpoint and a messaging standpoint and a unity within the Republican Party standpoint. So we do want to know a little bit more about J.D. Vance, and fortunately we do have an avenue to know that. So State Senator Josh McLaurin, he's from the North Fulton suburbs. He was a state rep here, now a state senator, a first-term state senator in Georgia. He was the roommate of J.D. Vance back at Yale Law. That was in 2010 and 2011. They went to Yale Law School together. And at the time, according to Josh McLaurin, they didn't see eye to eye at all. Josh McLaurin is a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and J.D. Vance was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican and conservative. But they would often have political debates, sort of each taking up the other side. They didn't stay friends by all accounts, but they stayed in touch at least until 2016. And they shared some Facebook messages. And in those Facebook messages, according to Josh McLaurin, the state senator from Georgia, he was trying to bridge the sort of disagreement between the two of them to find some common ground. And the common ground they found at that time in 2016 was that they were both fervently anti-Trump. J.D. Vance has had quite the journey because he was openly, publicly anti-Trump. He called himself a never Trumper. He said all sorts of things about how bad the country would be if Donald Trump was elected president. But he slowly became a convert up until the point Donald Trump actually endorsed JD Vance in 2022. There's some words I can't say on television, but it starts with SH and ends with T, when the former president he said, hey, JD Vance has said some blank about me, but if that was the standard, there wouldn't be anybody for me to endorse for Senate back in 2022. That shows you the mended fences between these two men to where now they are both running for the highest and second highest office of the land. Our own Patrick Quinn talked with State Senator McLaurin about his former roommate and about that message they sent back in 2016. Take a look.
Is former President Donald Trump America's Hitler? That's what his current vice presidential running mate questioned in 2016. Here's the text Senator Josh McLaurin says is from JD Vance, which reads, quote, I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical expletive like Nixon, who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that he's America's Hitler. That text from the now vice presidential candidate JD Vance sent to his law school roommate Josh McLaurin, who called the Vance then to the Vance now arguably the biggest flip-flop in American politics.
It's one thing to flip-flop, but it's another thing to do so with so much gusto in such a dramatic way after having laid out the case so insightfully for why Trump was a dangerous man.
McLaurin, who is out of the country, is a Georgia state senator representing North Atlanta. I called him up. What do you feel like you know about JD Vance that others may not know?
I roomed with him for a year.
Roommates in 2010 to 2011 at Yale Law School. This text from 2016, the same year Vance went on the Charlie Rose show and said this.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
So what's changed? We reached out to Vance's team for answers. They did not respond. But in 2022, former President Trump, seemingly unfazed by Vance's characterization of him, said Vance just didn't know him.
He said some bad things about me, but that was before he knew me, and then he fell in love.
McLaurin believes Trump chose Vance as his VP pick because they have an aligned brand. President Biden sees the same.
He's a clone of Trump on the issues.
For McLaurin, who has not spoken to Vance since 2016, he just wants voters to make sure they know the true JD Vance.
I think I want Americans to have as much information as possible to make the right decision this year and to think about the direction that our political culture is headed.
Patrick Quinn, Atlanta News First.
Well, there you have it. That's the story in terms of Senator Josh McLaurin, state senator from Georgia. And look, there's no love lost between these two. According to Senator McLaurin, they hadn't even talked since 2016. Neither considers the other a friend. As you saw, we did reach out to the office of JD Vance, and they actually responded. Can you imagine working in the Senate office of JD Vance when suddenly your freshman senator, U.S. senator, becomes the nominee for vice president? Their phone was ringing off the hook. It took them till the next day to get back to us with an email. But already J.D. Vance has come out publicly, and he's done this for the last 2 years, and said, hey, I was wrong. People change. My position has evolved over time after this message that he sent. And the other thing is, it's also a private message. Some of the things we saw on social media after I aired this story a couple of days ago, some people on social media were saying, wow, some friend, to share a private message. This was shared in confidence over Facebook Messenger. We've learned something in investigative reporting, too. Anything in writing doesn't stay secret for long, especially if it's incendiary as this was. But again, J.D. Vance has evolved. I mean, here you're seeing video of him before he had his beard and everything. He looked younger. He hadn't kind of grown into the role, but now he has. I mean, he's a freshman senator who was elected for the state of Ohio, and now he's the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party. It is an extraordinary story, no matter where you stand politically, no matter where you come down on the issues. But to see the journey that J.D. Vance has followed, it's almost a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, except that he did it very methodically, going to the U.S. Marines, going to Yale Law School. These things were far from predictable during his childhood in Middletown, Ohio. The other issue that right now the Republican Party is focusing heavily on, in fact, the word safety, if there was a single word that the Republican convention has focused upon, it's the word safety. So under the safety umbrella, if you will, is crime and immigration. And those two things really combine with the story of Laken Riley, who was murdered here in Georgia. We know the story, obviously, unfortunately, covered it because it was such a tragedy, but she was killed by someone who was in the country illegally, an undocumented immigrant. At least that's who's accused of killing her, awaiting trial, obviously innocent till proven guilty, but immediately that became a talking point amongst those who say, hey, look, we have these borders that are too porous, and this has become, it's been an issue for a very long time within the Republican Party, all the way back to 2016 and 2015 when Donald Trump was talking about building a wall and making Mexico pay for it. That issue is sort of back front and center again, and they're using the example of Laken Riley to show that, hey, look, this immigration problem, these aren't isolated incidents. These are incidents where people who are in the country illegally, undocumented immigrants, are committing horrific crimes. Statistically, they're committing crimes at a lower percentage than the general population. So it's hard to sort of make that argument from a statistical standpoint. But when you look at these sort of individual examples, obviously you have those cases where there have been people who are in the country illegally, undocumented, who have committed horrific crimes, and those are front and center within the proposals within the Republican Party, not only to strengthen the border, to limit immigration, both legal and illegal, but also there's this sort of focus on, hey, this has a lot to do with crime. And so there's a focus on these cities are where the crime is centered. Again, per capita, not always, those don't always hold up statistically, but the argument is that cities controlled by Democrats have more crime, and you have issues with people who are here illegally, and they're trying to combine those two things into a unified message that if you want to feel safe, remember, who are the switchables? Who are the people who switched to Joe Biden from Donald Trump back in 2020? They were the people in the suburbs, including the northern suburbs of Georgia, northern suburbs of Atlanta, I should say. Now, some of that's demographic change. I mean, every day, new people become Atlantans, and they're coming from somewhere else. So it's not as though a single person in the northern suburbs of Fulton County or in Gwinnett County or, you know, or in Cobb County or elsewhere are suddenly converting. It's that they're being, you know, sort of diluted, if you will, by people moving in from elsewhere, and those people have different ideologies. That's generally what's happening in our area, but you also do have this switchable person. There are people who have openly said, hey, I voted for Donald Trump, and then I voted for Joe Biden. They're the only ones in play. Those are the only people really, because everyone else has their mind made up. You know, everyone voting for Trump has their mind made up. Everyone voting for Biden has their mind made up. It's going to be very difficult to convince them to change their minds. A lot of places that are very similar to where JD Vance grew up. Same thing with Pennsylvania. We tend to focus on Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but there are a lot of areas in between that border a lot closer in time to the people living in those places than Joe Biden is. Joe Biden has lived, you know, in Delaware and then in D.C. for, you know, decades and decades and decades back to the 1970s. JD Vance just came out of Middletown, Ohio, so expect to see that on the campaign trail. But back to immigration, we do want to talk a little bit about that because Doug Reardon did focus on the Laken Riley case and specifically how that case is being used in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention.
The convention was Make America Safe Again, and it had a heavy focus on immigration. Even before the main lineup of speakers got on stage to start talking, they played a video here on the Jumbotron that blamed the Biden administration for the nation's border crisis and also didn't mention Riley by name, but did reference a college student who was killed by an undocumented person. Immigration is one of those issues that could determine how people vote in November, especially in Georgia, where the trial of Riley's accused killers continues, and the memory of that murder is still very potent, and it has been for a while. Riley's name was also mentioned at the State of the Union not long after she was killed. In fact, tonight, Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, who screamed at Biden to say Riley's name at the State of the Union, was seated right next to the former president. Delegates we talked to from Georgia here tonight say they want to see a change only Donald Trump can bring.
I live in Madison, Georgia, and you know, Athens is just right up the road. People are concerned, and that's what's happening here with the enthusiasm and the excitement. You know, this border thing is devastating.
I think immigration is a huge issue. It's been a huge issue forever. I mean, we've been talking about this since before the Obama years, and now it's at a breaking point in this country.
Another speaker was Atlanta reality star Savannah Chrisley. Her parents, both real estate moguls from the Atlanta area, were convicted of fraud in Fulton County. She hammered Fulton County prosecutors on stage, prompting applause from the crowd and a smile from Trump. From Milwaukee, Doug Reardon, Atlanta News First.
There we go. Sorry, my mic was cut there for a second. Excellent work by Doug Reardon there, who is, he's working around the clock. I can tell you, having covered, I was in Cleveland and Philadelphia for the conventions in 2016. As you know, in 2020, there really were no conventions because of COVID. Covered several other conventions, all the way back 2000. I was there for the convention that was at 2002. Also in Philadelphia, that's where the Republican convention was, but covered many of those conventions, working around the clock, and hats off to him. And we are going to try to have more live reports from him coming up in these live streams that we're going to be doing every day at 11 o'clock. But joining me now is Joy Lim-Nakrin. And Joy, you are not only an attorney, but you're also sort of the queen of streaming here
I don't know about that.
at Atlanta
the
News
queen
First.
Of streaming is actually sitting right there. You can't see her, but she's helping manage all the behind the scenes. There you can see her. Her little
that's so funny.
Maria Moreau waving, but I appreciate the grand introduction, Brendan, and I've so enjoyed listening to you streaming because of the depth of your political knowledge, and honestly, I've learned quite a bit just by listening to you.
Well, that's nice of you to say. Likewise, as you know, I'm a student of the law, but you're a doctor of the law. So, so let's get into the Secret Service. The Secret Service has obviously been under fire.
Yes.
There's even been some finger pointing since the Saturday attempt on the former president's life. That the local police even had to come out, and the local DA, and say, hey, it wasn't our fault.
That's
the Secret
right.
Service is in charge.
Yeah.
What's your perspective on where this stands and whether the Secret Service director can even survive this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's important for our viewers to know that there is going to be a House Oversight Committee hearing on Monday, where, frankly, the director for the Secret Service is expected to be grilled by lawmakers. And as you said, there's already been some finger pointing going on. We heard from the Butler County Emergency Services head, in Pennsylvania, essentially saying it was solely on the Secret Service to run security for this rally, but nevertheless, Butler County Emergency Services did provide officers from 23 different municipalities in their emergency unit to be on site and assist in security there. But again, emphasizing it was solely on the Secret Service to provide security for this event. And we see what happened in this rally. In addition to the House Oversight Committee hearing that I mentioned, Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General posted to their website that the agency is conducting a probe as well, saying the probe is to, quote, evaluate the United States Secret Service's process for securing former President Trump's July 13, 2024 campaign event. In addition to the FBI, Department of Homeland Security also investigating. So as you said, a lot of finger pointing, certainly a multi-agency investigation into the Secret Service handling of the rally there. And we're also learning a lot more about the shooter. And before I get into more about the shooter, I do want to also say that DHS and the FBI are also warning that they do have some concerns about the potential for retaliatory attacks following what happened at the rally. As for the shooter, I've just been looking into his background. We know that he's 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks, and he was actually set to reach a political milestone, 20 years old, so the very first time he could actually vote in a presidential election. Obviously, in 2020, he would have been 16 years old, but instead, this is what he allegedly carried out, and, some of the interesting details in the 48 hours before this attack, what we've learned is that he made a series of stops in and around his suburban Pittsburgh hometown, including to a shooting range where he was a member and apparently practiced firing in the 48 hours before the rally. Allegedly stopped at a Home Depot where he also picked up a ladder that is then believed to have been used to scale a building, where he then allegedly, set up an open fire. Also went to a gun store, purchased 50 rounds of ammunition, before then driving an hour north to Butler, Pennsylvania. Should also note, allegedly had an IED in his trunk wired to a transmitter that he carried, which investigators suspect was actually intended as sort of a distraction, sort of a distractive explosion, while he could effectively carry out the attack. But some really concerning details, clearly, that have been uncovered about this alleged shooter now, in what has just rocked the nation, and certainly in some ways has forced us all to kind of bridge the political divide and look at how we can create dialogues that are frankly safer.
A few more developments, too. I mean, the local news reporting out of Pittsburgh has been extraordinary. I'd even say it's been better than the national coverage. WPXI TV had an exclusive yesterday, for example, where they had a photograph we don't have because we're not an affiliate with them, but the photograph basically showed a remote control. This would be like a garage-type remote control, and a 9-volt battery and a phone. And the belief by the Secret Service was that was the trigger device for the explosives in the car. We can only speculate, and speculation is always dangerous in journalism, but analysis is something else. That analysis would be that the remote was to detonate the explosives, perhaps as a distraction.
Right.
And when you put the totality of the circumstances together, a couple of things. People talk about him walking. He walked about a mile from the Home Depot with a ladder.
Yeah.
And you're like, how could he walk with essentially an AR-style rifle, 50 rounds of ammunition, and a ladder for a mile, and nobody noticed? It turns out it was one of those collapsible ladders, is what we're hearing. So it collapses down, it telescopes down to a very small footprint. People were carrying lawn chairs, things like that, for outside of the perimeter, so this wouldn't have necessarily stuck out. But he was able to scale the roof. One other thing that came out from local reporting was, because the national reporting was that there were snipers who were actually in the building underneath the roof where he was poised as a sort of sniper's roost. That it turns out not to be true, at least according to the local reporting now, that they were in an adjacent building, was right next door, and that's where they were staging, so they weren't right there. But we do have that information that a police officer scaled the ladder, which he had still left up, and saw the alleged gunman with the rifle, and the alleged gunman pointed the rifle at the would-be assassin, and then the officer retreated, and it was seconds later that we heard the gunfire. So here's what my analysis as someone who covers public safety is
and
that—
who's a gun owner.
Well, and I've been a shooter and all of that, but you have a couple of things going on. The distance, everyone keeps saying 130 yards. I personally measured it using Google Earth data from GPS as about 175 yards. So it was within 175 yards. For a rifle shot, that's a layup. Even without a scope, with iron sights, that's a layup. You would expect a grouping very tight, under 2 inches. For even an amateur shooter, not even a professional shooter, certainly someone who'd spent some time at the range that day with the gun. But here's what you have is, once that officer scaled that ladder, and there's going to be plenty of questions of why did he not engage the shooter, and he's going to be grilled too about why that happened, because he would have put his own life at risk, but he would have saved the life of a retired fire chief, and he would have also kept the former president from being shot and 2 others from being shot. But that didn't happen. We'll have to find out why. But by all accounts, it was within seconds of the officer going back down the ladder that those shots were fired. One can only assume from an analysis standpoint that those shots were fired more quickly than the shooter intended. And perhaps if he was intending to set off explosives as a distraction, he never got that opportunity because of that officer actually seeing him there. Lots of questions are going to be coming up for that Secret Service director. I mean, it's a bit surprising. You know, I heard her interview that she did with CNN, and the interview that the director gave was interesting from the standpoint of, she kind of said, well, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she said, well, we'll take what, you know, we learned from this. We're doing our own review, and if there's any changes needed to make, we'll make them. I mean, this is the first attempted assassination of a former president of the United States since Ronald Reagan was president back in 1981. And so this is like as bad as it gets in the last several decades for the U.S. Secret Service. How has this director not been not been, forced to resign at this point?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And, who's to say that's not to come? Because, again, we have that grilling that is scheduled by the House Oversight Committee July 22nd. And you've touched on some of the questions, but so many, including why were we hearing from members of the crowd that were in the rally who have gone on television, spoken to the media about how they first spotted the potential threat and alerted security officers from there. So certainly a lot of questions, and definitely the Secret Service is under fire. Like I said, being investigated not only by the Department of Homeland Security, but also the FBI and lawmakers. And frankly, the general public, under scrutiny from the general public.
And one more thing we hear now is that actually security was increased for Donald Trump's appearances because Iran had essentially started a plot to take out the former president as retaliation for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. They killed him in Iraq back in 2020, and the Iran pledged revenge, and that it would come over time. It's the reason that a lot of former Trump cabinet members still have bodyguards today. There was a threat directly against John Bolton, for example, the national security advisor. And so then you have this plot, according to multiple news reports and officials now confirming it, that there was this plot to take out Donald Trump, so that the Secret Service admits, our protection was actually much greater than it would have normally been, which then leads to the question: how does a 20-year-old with a borrowed rifle from his dad and a Home Depot ladder purchased that morning scale a rooftop within 175 yards of the president? I mean, anyone, you don't even have to have any training. All you have to have seen is maybe 2 movies to know that rooftop, other than the water tower in the image, is the best shooter's position. How was someone not watching that rooftop? How was there not a single officer assigned? Just have an officer sit up there with the best view in the house, and then there's no chance of a shooter getting up there. There's Monday morning quarterbacking, but then there's just sort of basic planning, and it seems like the advanced team is going to face a lot of questions in all of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, of course, we're going to follow the latest with that House Oversight Committee. But also, as you know, Brendan, a lot of new developments this week regarding the various legal challenges that Mr. Trump has been facing. As we shared with our audience on Monday, the federal classified documents case against the former president was dismissed. So certainly that was a major victory. But you and I were talking yesterday about the possibility of an appeal, by the DOJ, maybe even Special Counsel Jack Smith, that could potentially land here in Atlanta, which is, like you said, the headquarters of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So that's some other stuff that we've been watching as well. But also yesterday, we learned that December 5th is now the date that has been set for the State Court of Appeals to hear some of the issues about Mr. Trump's Fulton County case regarding alleged election interference. So, initially it had been an October date that had been set, but we know in September he's going to be sentenced. That's the September 17th or 18th, I believe, is the sentencing date for Mr. Trump's New York, what we call the hush money, what is kind of colloquially been called the hush money trial. Obviously he was convicted of falsifying business records in New York, so the sentencing date will be in September. And then in October is when, here in Georgia in the Court of Appeals, we were supposed to be listening to the arguments about essentially Mr. Trump's case under Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, and now that's been December.
So there's no chance, because of that date of December 5th, which, by the way, is a month after the election.
Right.
If he's the president-elect, then, now look, it's important to point out, these are state charges in Georgia, prosecuted by the county district attorney. Even if those go forward into next year, if he's the sitting president of the United States, all precedent case law says he can't be tried while he's president. I know that there's really no precedent for this, but it's been understood that pretty much all litigation, civil or criminal, against the president is on hold while he's the president, because the people need the president to do the job of running the country, of being president. So there's a question of if it's not till December 5th, does this Fulton case ever get heard at all?
Yeah, and that's a good question because it's important to remember what we're talking about happening on December 5th is essentially a hearing about the trial. So this whole thing on December 5th is just to determine whether Ms. Fonnie Willis, District Attorney Fonnie Willis, gets to remain as the top prosecutor on that case because obviously Mr. Trump and his co-defendants and their legal teams have been arguing she should be removed because partly part of the reason is her admitted affair with former special prosecutor Nathan Wade and some other issues, but that decision likely won't come until 2025 on just that particular issue. I mean, there's a deadline of, I believe it's March of 2025, but this is just to determine that issue, whether she gets to take the case and keep going forward. So when does the actual trial happen? I mean, we know that the legal world moves very, very slowly, that there are numerous pretrial motions, that there are hearings like what we're seeing here, and Mr. Trump has an amazing team of lawyers. Here in Georgia, he's got Steve Sadow, and they understand, like any good lawyer does, that basically misdirection, delay, all of these things are going to give your client, the defendant, an advantage.
That's right. And so now what we have, just to recap the criminal cases against the former president, you have the business records / hush money trial in New York. He's been convicted, multiple felonies, facing sentencing on that. That sentencing was delayed by the U.S. Supreme Court decision saying any acts the president takes while in office that could even be within the outer bounds of the official duties are immune. This would obviously, here's why that falls under that. You're like, wait, that has nothing to do with it. This was about the Stormy Daniels case that happened when he was running for president, except that he made the payments to his lawyer, then lawyer, Cohen, while he was president. And so are those within the outer bounds of official acts of the presidency? Probably not, but he's entitled to make that appeal and that argument. And so because of that, they delayed the sentencing now till September.
That's right.
In fact, the sentencing would have happened right before what turned out to be, I think it was Thursday of last week, which would have been right before the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. There's a question of whether he wouldn't have been in the path of that bullet had that sentencing occurred
that's an excellent point,
on
Brendan.
Thursday. It's fascinating, right? So that's that case. That's the only case.
You got four.
That's right.
Just to remind everyone, because it is complicated, you had the New York trial, the hush, in terms of just criminal trials, not talking about the civil lawsuits, but just criminal trials. The case in New York, which now Mr. Trump was convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records, felony counts. You've got the case here in Fulton County, Georgia, for alleged election interference. You had the federal case in Florida for alleged mishandling of classified documents, alleged hoarding of classified documents at Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago, Florida estate. That was then dismissed, but that doesn't mean that's the end of that story. And then you got the other federal case, again, for January 6th. So it is, frankly, it's kind of a legal nightmare. I mean, it's case upon case upon case upon case, and this is just in the criminal realm.
Yeah, except that Donald Trump keeps winning them.
That's true.
I mean, and when I say winning them, he's been convicted, but he's winning the delay game. Because what's going to happen, okay, so let's just take the Florida documents case real quick. The Florida documents case, I thought that Judge Cannon was going to throw it out somehow on the grounds of these were official acts by the president and those are now immune based on the Supreme Court of the United States. But that's not what she ruled. She basically said you can't, that a special counsel can't be appointed without confirmation by Congress and appropriations by Congress. There's zero case law to support that.
That's right.
And it's probably going to fail on appeal, but the appeal gets Donald Trump to Election Day, and if you get him to Inauguration Day, he can simply order his Justice Department to drop the case against him. And while that sounds corrupt, hey, guess what? It's completely legal under what the Supreme Court ruled. So it's sort of a round trip there where the Supreme Court had said, yeah, you can do that.
But just an interesting sidebar that I was thinking about is, Judge Eileen Cannon in Florida ruled that with the documents mishandling case, it was unconstitutional to appoint special counsel Jack Smith. But remember, that was kind of the same mechanism used in the Hunter Biden case. So that's just kind of a sidebar. I know how.
No, but it's true. I mean, it's good for the goose. It's good for the gander. I mean, if I was Hunter Biden's legal team, I would be making the same argument that, hey, Judge Cannon just ruled this. Now, granted, it would have to be in the same circuit and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But if it does get upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, it basically vacates the convictions against Hunter Biden.
Well,
And no one was complaining on the other side at that point.
And we've seen, we're talking about also the immunity ruling, that was for a federal case, and yet it did have an impact on the state case in New York. So we see that sometimes legal precedent can be set even across jurisdictions. The courts do look to other courts for legal precedent, and even if it doesn't have a direct impact, it could have an indirect impact.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point because, I mean, again, if Hunter Biden's attorneys are worth their salt, they're already filing that motion or at least constructing it. Yeah, Joy Lim-Nakrin, always great to have your legal expertise. I know just enough about the law to get in trouble. My knowledge is a mile wide and an inch deep, but you obviously have a Juris Doctor, so it's always great to have your viewpoints.
I so appreciate it, Brendan. You know enough to get us all out of trouble as
well.
Oh,
thank you. Yeah, I could give you legal advice, but I can't because that'd be against the law, so we're not going to do that. So thanks for joining us, Joy. And we do have another report now from Doug Reardon, who is actually there at the convention in Milwaukee. He's our Atlanta News First political reporter, and he's been there around the clock. I don't know when Doug's sleeping because he's with us in the morning and he's all the way up until 11 o'clock at night. But he has this report from the floor of the convention.
It is day 3 of the Republican National Convention here at Fiserv Arena in Milwaukee, and today's theme is Make America Strong Again. Yesterday, let's just talk about that a little bit. The theme was Make America Safe Again, and we heard a lot about immigration. Georgia had a big presence during day 2 of the RNC. We'll start by talking about that issue of immigration. Laken Riley, of course, a Georgia student who was found dead on the University of Georgia campus. She went to a nursing school nearby. At the beginning of the year, her accused killer is someone who is in this country illegally, had a criminal history. Her name was mentioned several times by the speakers here last night, including one of the keynote speakers, Senator Ted Cruz of Florida. Also, they played a video before those speakers took the stage blaming the Biden administration for the nation's border crisis and not naming Laken Riley by name per se, but referencing her as a college student who was killed by an undocumented person. And so that was the theme of yesterday. Today, we will certainly be expecting an address from JD Vance, the former president's vice presidential candidate pick. He is going to address the crowd here tonight as the keynote speaker. He is going to very much relay a message of unity, as we've heard from all of the speakers here at the RNC so far. That was something that was really called for after Saturday's events in Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump almost lost his life in an assassination attempt. Ever since then, there have been a lot of calls for unity, and there have been a lot of echoing of that calls here at the RNC. Just take, for example, last night's lineup of speakers. We mentioned Governor Ron DeSantis. He was a one-time primary challenger to former President Trump. They had really exchanged a lot of harsh words together, and also consider that Nikki Haley was added to the lineup very late. She wasn't at first invited at all to this convention, but she later was, and not only that, but added as a keynote speaker. She was not only a primary challenger to Trump, but also stripped a lot of votes away from him, especially in Georgia, where it was almost 100,000 votes going her way. And so she was here last night talking about safety, talking about public law enforcement, talking about immigration as a keynote speaker. And so if the Republicans were trying to shift this conversation and really put a premium on unity, I think they did a pretty good job of doing that last night. Now, again, what we are looking for tonight is the address from JD Vance, who, again, is very, very young. He adds a lot of youth to this ticket in a time where age is a huge factor for voters here between these two candidates, who either of them would be the oldest president in history when they finish their second terms. And so, this is something that we're going to be keeping an eye on. What is his message going to be here to Americans tonight? I heard somebody say on the floor yesterday, one of the delegates saying, you only get one chance to make that good first impression. And so that is exactly what J.D. Vance is going to be doing tonight, is pitching himself to the Americans as someone who can take over should Donald Trump, the worst should happen, or maybe possibly even in 4 years, should Trump not decide to run again. One other thing I do want to mention, there was an investigation that was launched just this morning by Homeland Security into Saturday's events in Pennsylvania with that assassination attempt. And so there are now several agencies that are going to be reviewing this. I know that Congress has wanted to hear from Director Sheetal of the Secret Service, and they may call her in to testify as well. And so that is still very much the undertone here at the RNC, is safety and what happened in Pennsylvania on Saturday. And so we will be here all day covering this day 3 of the Republican National Convention from here in Milwaukee. But for now, we'll send it back to you at the ANF Plus desk.
All right, I'm going to start speaking very lowly, if lowly is an adverb. The reason I'm speaking low is because you probably turned your volume up a little bit to hear Doug, and I don't want to blow your speakers out. So I'm going to give you a chance to turn your volume down just a little bit on your phone, on your AirPods or whatever you kids call them these days. Okay, now I can speak at my normal voice because you've adjusted your volume. Doug also is very soft-spoken, and the reason he is because he is Johnny on the spot with the facts. He just knows the facts, and so Doug can speak a little. I scream everything because I'm trying to make a point, and he just has all the facts, and I'm just here with the analysis. That's Doug Reardon at the Milwaukee Republican National Convention, at the floor of the convention. It's so great to have him. Here's a live shot. As you can see, nothing's happening. You're like, well, why are we doing a live stream when nothing's happening? Because we're here to tell you what's going to happen. So we do have sort of a schedule of not only what's going to happen at the Republican National Convention, which you can see on AtlantaNewsFirst.com, but also what's going to happen here on Atlanta News First and Atlanta News First Plus. So we have special coverage, and we have it all the way through Friday, so even with a recap. There's a 9 o'clock special streaming on Atlanta News First Plus, and then at 10 o'clock on Atlanta News First. So you can actually see us. And now, if you're watching this outside of the Atlanta area, you're like, I don't get Atlanta News First Plus or Atlanta News First. Yes, you do. At AtlantaNewsFirst.com, and also on our YouTube channel where we stream our reports so you can see them. And we have this special coverage, including this live stream, which just seems to get better every day, doesn't it? If you've been following us the last couple of days, it's been entertaining to watch me fall apart on the air, but not today. We're on top of it today. And we're going to be back tomorrow with another 11 a.m. live stream. And that's going to be the big day after JD Vance does his acceptance speech tonight and before Donald Trump does his acceptance speech for the nomination for the Republican Party. And then we're going to wrap the whole thing at 11 a.m. on Friday and sort of wrap it up. And then we're going to give the same coverage to the Democratic National Convention because we don't take sides here. We're here to tell it like it is, tell the truth. We're in the truth business. That's what we do. And we're going to make sure you get all sides. And we're going to give the analysis. We're going to cover them exactly the same way and with exactly the same depth. And then tonight, you can also see us not only on Atlanta News First, but also Atlanta News First Plus and YouTube. And one more plug for the website, just because that's where you can see my stories under the Investigates tab at AtlantaNewsFirst.com. And we'll see you again tomorrow and later today. Thanks for watching.